All right, let's do this thing. Zach Bush, thank you for gracing me with your presence. Thank you for coming on the Evolving Man podcast.
Ben, it's so good to be with you and the audience. It's good to be alive today.
Yes, it is. Zach, it's been a long time coming having you on my show. I've listened to so much of your content, so much of your interviews on other people's shows, and I think it's probably worth noting some of those. I'm going to link to a lot of your other content and to your business in the show notes. Um, I remember first hearing uh, your interview on the Neurohacker Collective, and you talked about glyphosate, you talked about the soil, you talked about the biome, and you blew my mind in that respect. And that was before the pandemic. And the Rich Roll podcast, which was a really good one. Again, I was just like enthralled with what you were sharing, and then the pandemic hit, and I heard you on Luke Story's show, and Mark Groves, who's a good friend of mine, lives just down the street, had you on his show, and um, first of all, I just want to thank you for taking so much time to share what you've seen in the world and your perspective on things as a doctor, someone who went through med school and practiced for so long and did a number of things, worked in hospice, sat with people dying and who's had his own spiritual journey. You know, these are the types of people that I want to have on my show. A man who has been, deeply involved with science, but is also deeply connected to himself and is really passionate about connecting to nature. Um, so I just want to start by thanking you for all the work that you're doing. I think you have a insanely rigorous schedule, and yeah, just thank you, Zach, for doing everything you do
Yeah,
in the world.
well, it's my pleasure, Ben. It's when you're in your purpose and have a sense of passion for it, your work becomes your highest calling, and it just doesn't feel like work. It starts to feel like play every day. So I'm
Yeah,
blessed to be having all those dominoes line up in my life, and I'm always grateful.
yeah. So, to set the stage in terms of what I would like to talk to you today about, being a guy who has heard you, you've been in my ear for over 10 hours in my life for sure. Um, Here we are. It's June 2021. I'm in Canada, and you're in the US. And the pandemic has been happening for a year and a half. And I'm starting to have conflicts in my life I'm seeing conflicts a lot on Facebook, a lot of conflicts on social media, people having debates. I'm having conflicts in my own life. And the, it's about which side are you on, vaccine or no vaccine? Do you believe in the health system? Do you believe in the authorities or not? And it's a very sort of polarizing thing, right? And even to be questioning of the dominant narrative is means you're like an anti-vaxxer or a conspiracy theorist. And myself, I, I have dabbled. I have been on both sides. Like I am on both sides of a lot of things. I like to stay balanced in my life. I really like to be an evidence-based person. I like to look for the evidence in something and find what's true. I respect the scientific process. My dad's a doctor. Like I grew up like sitting at the kitchen table listening to my parents talking about what was happening in the hospital and dealing with patients, and like doctor speak was like the classic. Um, and at the same time, like I have had a number of spiritual journeys where I have seen things and experienced things that were indescribable and way beyond like evidence-based anything. And I'm nurturing a relationship to my intuition and learning to listen to my wife's intuition, which often comes with zero concrete evidence whatsoever. um, and I'm learning the value of those things and listening to those things, and all of the other paradigms that are medical, that are outside the North American medical system. I've been to Peru. I've done ayahuasca, and I've done plant medicines, and I'm quite respectful and honoring of Native American traditions and the medicine wheel, and I've sat in sweat lodge, right? So I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just trying to share the experiences that I've had that have informed where I sit, and it's not a simple, skeptic place. Like I'm not just like I identify as a skeptic. I'm actually like I like to dabble in a lot of different ways of understanding the world, and um, the conflict I'm seeing right now is like even anything outside of the dominant narrative of uh, we all have to social distance, wear a mask, indoors, outdoors, in some cases, get vaccinated, everyone, um, and follow the instructions that are given to you at all times, sanitized constantly. Um, any questioning of that is like I'm a conspiracy theorist or an anti-vaxxer, or in the eyes of even just some of my family members, like I'm a lunatic. And you know, how does a guy like me balance those things in this time? Um, how do I sort through it all? I know this is a big question, but it's almost like I would like that to be almost the theme of what we cover here, and we can get into some detail. But I thought I'd open up the container with that.
I love it. I love it. We'll see how much we can pour in there. So yeah, I think there's things coming to mind as you go through that experience. Well said for all of us right now. It doesn't matter which side of the paradox you fall on. But my wife brought up paradox again in our own personal lives this week, as to the importance of recognizing both. Regardless of the subject you tackle, there's a paradox that there's two opposite and equal realities that are competing for some sort of
Yeah.
attention. And so Zen Buddhism, I think, really is the classic yin and yang, is really pointing to that equal paradox within everything. And so whether it's the bonsai tree that you're trying to shape, or the startup company you're working on, or your 20-year relationship, whatever it is, there's going to be these simultaneous paradoxes, paradoxical issues that are present. And the danger is that you become one or the other, right? And so the danger is you become a pro-vaxxer, and you stomp around saying anybody who's not getting vaccinated is a chemical warfare agent trying to kill people around you. And
Right.
the opposite danger is that you become an anti-vaxxer, which means you have no stance, because as soon as you become anti-something, you are anti-matter. You are the thing that doesn't exist, and you're simply pouring more energy into the word vaccination, whether you think you might be anti-vax. In that stance, you're fueling the other one, because you're not representing the other side of the paradox, which is actually pro-immune. And so if you're a pro-immune system or a pro-vaccine, it reframes the subject completely, right?
Mhm.
Because the implication then is, if you're not pro-immune system, then what are you? And if you feel like somehow pro-vaccine is somehow in line with pro-immune system, then you have no problem with me. We both agree that the immune system is important. You happen to believe that your immune system doesn't work unless you get genetically engineered to produce a protein that's a toxin to the bloodstream. My difference is, I think my body knows how to manage the existing genetic information in the environment, which is virome, which is viral in source, and each cell will decide whether I should make these proteins or not, and I should not probably genetically engineer my immune system to do one thing,
Mhm.
and so that's a completely different conversation. You get a completely different response. Whereas if you come in as an anti-vaxxer and say, I'm afraid you're shedding proteins and you're going to hurt my family if you come near us, because, well, that could be totally true, but your stance on that is going to shift the energy of the conversation. So I think if you can step back to that 30,000-foot view and say, oh yes, there's a paradox happening in humanity. One side of humanity has decided that it's waiting for the pharmaceutical chemical industry to invent a new genetically engineering molecule or product every 3 to 6 months, because we know that degenerative rate of viruses is we're going to have every 3 months 10 to 100 more variants that are now stable within the human population and moving around the planet. And that's been happening for 780 years on the record for coronaviruses, and that's not going to stop. And so 780 years without these genetically engineered devices to interact with the immune system versus the future that we don't know. And these are ways for us to step back and be like, okay, I'm not anti-vax or pro-vax. In fact, the whole concept of these genetically engineered injections is part and parcel, a tiny part of the bigger reality that in my bloodstream right this moment I have 10 to the 15 viruses coursing through my bloodstream, 10 to the 15 different viruses. And so I am a genetic machine that knows how to pick and choose which genetic updates I need. And the Cas9 enzyme within every single one of my 70 trillion cells gets to figure out which of those trillions of viruses that I will take up and reproduce or integrate genetic information into my genome, etc. And so we back up, we realize the human body is in constant genetic swapping, genetic communication with our greater ecosystem. If we choose to reach for a genetic engineered mechanism of micromanaging that relationship from the pharmaceutical company, we need to understand that it's a small part of the reality of what's going on every day. On the same day you get that injection, Cas9 in 70 trillion cells is going to decide what other billion updates do you need that doesn't come from a pharmaceutical company but comes from nature. Your
Mm-hmm.
body is constantly updating itself. It's homeostasis rather than reactionary relationship to the microbiome, the biome at large. And so it's exciting to realize your body's in constant dynamic real-time genetic updating from the virome. The vaccine is a piece of that puzzle on a day or a week that you get that injection. What do we know about that? It's completely unexplored. What we know is we have a pretty poor track record of trying to micromanage our relationship to viruses. The flu vaccine is the most ubiquitous of all of our viral vaccines that are given every year, and that flu vaccine has a pretty poor track record. It's never once been able to show in any clinical trial in any time in history that it changes the rate of infection of influenza. The only outcomes that are measurable that are all at all arguably beneficial is that in small segments of the population in each trial, and it seems to vary as to the inclusion criteria and all of that, there's a small segment in each trial that seems to have shorter duration of symptoms. And so instead of being sick for 3.5 days, it's 3 days. On average, it's 6 hours difference between vaccine and no vaccine as to how long your symptoms exist with flu.
Yeah.
That would be one thing. It's like, okay, do I think it's important to have a flu vaccine so I have shorter duration of symptoms? If that's an important outcome to you, maybe you like the flu vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the data doesn't stop there. And what we find out is that when you get the flu vaccine, instead of giving you the normal immunity to the entire virus, we've taken pieces of the virus and we're now putting that into a flu vaccine to try to get an immunogenic reaction. We actually are incomplete in that response from the body if it's vaccine versus real virus. If you get exposed to the real virus influenza and your body decides how to deal with that, maybe you have a day or two of fever, maybe some aches, and then you get over it. Maybe you are asymptomatic and your body simply adapts to it quickly and never goes on to have any symptomatic response to it. But in those situations where you see the real virus, the next 12 months, you're protected from a whole host of other viruses because your immune system has learned a fundamental relationship not to just influenza, but to adenovirus, echovirus, coronavirus, and the rest. Interestingly, if you then get a flu vaccine instead of letting your body be exposed to the real thing, your risk of coronavirus goes up markedly in the next 12 months. And so you've not only lost the kind of field immunity response, you've predisposed yourself to getting coronavirus. And so if the CDC and WHO had really been confident that coronavirus was 30 times more deadly than flu, which is what they said in January of 2020, they should have immediately stopped all flu vaccines for the second half of the second 2/3 of the rest of the flu season. But they didn't. They continued to vaccinate. In fact, there was a big push to get people flu vaccinated. knowing the science 3 times over since 2000. There's first study like '08, second study 12, third study 2017. 3 studies proving that coronavirus risk goes up after a flu vaccine. We knew the science for 12, 13 years, and yet we continued to more aggressively do something that we knew was putting the public at risk to coronavirus. So we have this extraordinary trust in something called a vaccine. We seem to be able to now put that title on anything because the current, rejections that people are getting for, SARS-CoV-2 with that spike protein genetic engineering mechanism has nothing to do with any definition of vaccines in history.
Right. It's new.
It should be called a GMO, mechanism. It should be a genetically modified or genetic engineering device. It has nothing to do with vaccination. And so vaccination is by definition taking a virus or bacteria and making it weakened or unable to replicate, or you somehow damage that virus or bacteria so that it doesn't become an immediate threat. But it gives a whole host of reactionary experiences for the host. So the immune system can see all kinds of different proteins on the surface and within the virus or whatnot. So this
Right.
new
That would
genetic
be
engineering thing is a misnomer. And as soon as you throw that vaccine title on there, it gives the majority of the global population trust in the mission of that drug.
right. So the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, is, from what I know, is the old style of vaccine, and Pfizer and Moderna are the ones that made the mRNA, which is the new style that you're talking about.
Johnson and Johnson loved that marketing. They really wanted to pitch themselves as like the more tried and true technology. But they
Right.
are genetic engineering just as well. So they again are not taking any part of coronavirus. What they're taking is the capsid or the envelope of a different virus that has nothing to do with corona, and they're putting the genetic information from corona that makes the
Mm.
spike protein in there. It's the DNA strand. It's the same DNA that makes the mRNA that both Pfizer and Moderna use. So while they say they're using an older technique, it's still nothing to do with the way in which vaccines have ever worked. It's still genetic engineering using a DNA strand rather than an mRNA strand. Okay, we've tried this before to horrible outcomes. This is why we tried it with MERS, we tried it with SARS. We have had terrible track record with trying to genetically edit,
Mhm.
DNA mechanisms before for other things. Some of the other, ones, rotavirus was one of the ones we tried one of these DNA vaccines on, and it was horrific outcomes, neurologic damage, another one was intussusception, which is this involution of the small intestines that collapses into itself, and you get immediate bowel obstruction. You can die within hours of bowel obstruction. Like horrific results from these vaccines in the past. And so, and it's not by coincidence that the Johnson and Johnson one has run into the biggest problems with public health, and it's already been frozen in the
Right.
United States 3 times for emergency FDA review because of the number of complications we're getting. So it seems to be the
Mhm.
least healthy of or the highest risk of the 3 at the moment. But as everybody's now knowing, because of the last few 4 weeks, is that all of them are coming under massive concerns because now it's clear that the bodies of people who are being injected with these are chronically producing these spike proteins in many different organ systems, which it was never, somehow somebody had decided that wasn't possible. I don't know how they possibly decided that because the body never like sequesters a virus in your shoulder, which is literally what they tell us. Like, we'll inject
Right.
in your shoulder and won't get into your body. It's like, no,
Right.
that doesn't work. There is no shoulder compartment of your body. Like
Yeah.
once past the skin, it is system wide.
Right.
So we should have known that. It's pretty obvious we did know that, but somehow we justified in our brain that no, this mRNA is going to be sequestered in your shoulder. It's impossible that's true, but that was the party line. And now it's clear that as soon as you inject this, you can find liver cells, pancreas cells, brain cells all over the body are making spike proteins, which are toxins. They're profoundly inflammatory toxins to the vascular system and beyond, neurologic system being a big one. So now the whistleblowers are being joined by the pro-vaccine data collectors, and so you've got a good one is to look up is Byram Beidel, Dr.
Hmm.
Byram Beidel. Bridle. I'm sorry, Bridle, Byram Bridle, and he's a medical doc who's one of the pro-vaccine, science groups that's working on trying to figure out how to uh, get that data out there that it's safe. And so he was part of the operational safety study, and they started seeing all this data flying in from labs all over the world that people were starting to have not only complications, but they were having positive protein synthesis throughout their body from this mRNA injection. So he was one of the first to come out a few weeks ago with national online stuff saying we have a serious protein problem with this protein production that we didn't anticipate.
So yeah, I have a question about that because I mean, I have 100 questions from all of the things that you just said, but just to address that in particular around the body making the spike protein, I'm comparing this to people who actually get COVID because to me, the choice is I'm getting COVID or I'm getting the vaccine or I'm getting both, right? And I do want to discuss this with you as well. Is like, are we really gonna is this thing really going to go away? Because like we've never gotten rid of the flu, but everybody's like, oh, we got to get the vaccine because that's going to snuff out COVID. We're going to get rid of it for good. The house is on fire, and the vaccine is the fire truck. So don't be complaining about the quality of the water, folks. Like this thing's coming here to put the fire out, and I'm like, the vaccine is not a fire truck putting out a fire. Like this is like I mean, if this isn't endemic, like I don't really know what is. But so I do want to cover that. But I want to ask you about like, um, when someone gets COVID, is the body making the spike protein, and you know, uh, doesn't the body mount its own response against that and recover? What's the difference between the body making the spike protein from the vaccine versus making the spike protein when you get infected with COVID?
Yeah. So the science on this gets a little bit complicated, but it's a very well established science. In fact, is super ironically, the woman, well, actually, it's a pair, a male female team, but the woman who won and got most of the recognition for the Nobel Prize that was assigned in chemistry for 2020. So, right during the pandemic,
Mhm.
Dr. Dwadna, and her name is awesome for this field of study because it's spelled DOUDNA. So DUDNA, that's Dr. Dwadna. And so she discovered Cas9, which determines which RNA strands or DNA strands coming in from viral sources are transcribed. And in my recent global health education event, every month I do a free, couple hours long presentation on deep dive on science in different areas. And I did one a couple months ago called GMO, Engineering Nature Out of Humanity. And in the last half hour of that 3 hour deep dive on the science of genetic engineering, I cover the vaccines. And in that, I take a clip from her 2016 TED Talk where she covers Cas9, which is the enzyme again that's determining whether or not we transcribe viral proteins. And what she says is that her and her co investigator at the time, who was the guy who wins the Nobel Prize with her in 2020, they got the Nobel Prize for discovering that Cas9 was the equivalent of a vaccine card. She literally says that in 2016. She says Cas9 is the equivalent of a vaccine card. Every single virus you've ever seen is recorded and remembered by Cas9,
Right.
and you will forever be in relationship to those viruses in a balanced fashion because Cas9 has seen that protein instruction. And so that mRNA strand or DNA strand comes in, and whether or not Cas9 decides to work with that is both intentional, it's highly regulated whether you will go on to express a naturally occurring virus or not. And if you don't, it will remember that you decided not to, and it will forever reject that messenger in the form of another virus. So very clear evidence, Nobel Prize winners in 2020 telling you that the body has an innate capacity for remembering every virus it's ever seen and transcribed. Importantly, there's a lot of genetic information in a virus. And it's, I mean, when I say a lot, it's a lot more than a spike protein, right? And so there's a bunch of proteins that have to be produced to reproduce viral genetics and viral structure such that you would go on to pass that information back out into the environment. That's important because Cas9 is regulated as well as many other ribosomal steps. Ribosomes are the big proteins or enzymes that manage the translation between transcription between DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis. So there's all these steps that happen in the nucleus and in the cytoplasm of the cell that are very carefully regulated. If they weren't carefully regulated, then I would die instantly because the 10 to the 15 viruses in my bloodstream would completely take over every cell in my body instantly, and I'd be dead, literally within minutes. Best case scenario, maybe an hour of life.
Right.
The reason I don't die right now is because Cas9 is actively making a conscious decision with 270 other protein regulators in every single cell of my body, and so it really is literally one of the most regulated relationships to nature that we have. The thing that terrifies me about the reality of this genetic engineering device that we're now calling a vaccine is that if in fact as many people as they say are actually going on to form antibodies, it means that somehow they have overwhelmed the innate immune system, which is all that stuff around Cas9. They've managed to overwhelm all those regulatory checks and balances to force every cell in the body, at least the vast majority of cells in the body studied, to start making this protein.
Right.
That's pretty scary. What it means is they've figured out how to put genetic promoters and genetic tricks into around that sequence that would code for the spike protein. They figured out how to bypass all the checks and balances, which means when I get injected, my body can't make the same intelligent decision at every organ system or every cell as to what I'm going to do with that new genetic information. And so, yes, the DNA strand in the Johnson & Johnson mRNA strand in the other two are new approaches to inducing an immune response, but more frighteningly, whatever they put around that is really what concerns me. Is they are now overwhelming the intelligence of my innate immune system to force my body to make this spike protein, which is a toxin to my neurologic system. That seems like insanity to me.
Right.
And yet, here my colleagues are saying we have to have this because antibodies are necessary to snuff out coronavirus. So we need to back up for a second and ask, is that even true? Like you said, everybody says this house is on fire and it will never go away if we don't have a vaccine. Well, this cannot be true because it's never been true. And we have a very long backwards lens on this. Like I said, we can track coronaviruses back in the human experience as far back 780 years. You can actually find viral, record in the whole genetics. And so, corpses, their bones dug up, you can show 780 years of coronavirus present in our genetic sequencing. And so that incredible track record gets up to date in 2002 when we have the first big global pandemic of SARS,
Mhm.
this new version of coronavirus, and it snuffed out at exactly 2 years. And so we went through two long cycles of global homeostasis with this new viral syndrome, this new viral update. The whole population of the world became balanced with it. Some people had gotten sick and died. The vast majority got mildly sick or not at all sick. And so the whole population sees that and it's gone in 2 years. 10 years later, a new variant emerges. We call it MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And that emerges and is there for exactly 2 years. At the very beginning of COVID-19 in January, February, I was on podcast after podcast saying, everybody stop panicking because in 2 years this is going to be gone. And don't let them come out with some vaccine in 18 months and tell you that vaccine made this thing go away, which I
Right.
guarantee you is going to be the message come January of 2022 of, oh my God, Moderna saved the world. Coronavirus is now gone. There's some new variants out there. You need new injections because there's new variants that you need to attack. They're going to claim success over something that biologically is necessary and biologically is obligated to occur every time without a vaccine. It
Hmm.
is going to come into balance. A lot of people are saying, yeah, but isn't it a man made virus? Well, I don't care if it is or not. It's still going to have to go through the same journey. It doesn't matter its origin, whether a human lab or a big pile of pig stool in China. Either one of those is going to bring us into homeostasis with this new genetic
Hmm.
information.
So you think, yeah, this is an interesting thing. You think that based on past history of coronaviruses, that this is going to like go away completely, or at least stop killing people by the 2 year mark? Because like my regular guy observation of this is like, um, with not knowing the history that you know about coronaviruses particularly, I'm like, well, this thing's going to be like the flu. Like, how is this ever going away? Like, isn't it just going to continue to mutate? And yeah, I mean, the people who got vaccinated originally are just going to like get their vaccination like they would normally get a flu vaccination every year, and it's just going to keep circulating in the population, and which of course would offer plenty of opportunity for draconian measures, or the powers that be telling people what they have to do in order to protect themselves.
So what will go away is SARS-CoV-2, which is a description of the genetics of the pandemic, version that came out in probably really emerged in September or October of 2019. The first cases that were really being reported in China come out in late December, but tracking back in the blood banks of China, it's pretty clear it was there way before December. So typical emergence, which is always going to happen in that kind of late summer era in South Asia, you're going to see the emergence of a bunch of new flu strains, a bunch of new stuff. The difference between flu every year and coronavirus every year is that coronaviruses, which there's hundreds of variants of that are normal experiences, they cause the common cold.
Right.
The number of deaths from coronavirus every year is essentially zero. Every 10 years or so, every 6 to 8 to 10 years, we see an emergence of a new strain of coronavirus that will cause more of a flu-like syndrome that can have downstream complications. After the virus is gone, your immune system's out of control, you end up getting secondary pneumonia, and you die of something else, but you can attribute it to maybe upstream there was this event called coronavirus. That's SARS, that's MERS, and that's COVID-19. So every 8 years you get another one of these events. And so that part will happen again, but it's not going to happen next year. The caveat is if they continue to run around the planet with PCR telling us that this thing hasn't gone away,
Right.
they're lying through a scientific mechanism of being overly sensitive and non-specific with the test itself. So now you're picking up people that got vaccinated, or you're picking up people that got exposed and have integrated that genetic engineering into them. They're not sick anymore, they're not symptomatic, but they'll continue to test PCR positive if you do enough replications of the PCR amplification. So it's this trick that's going to happen. So it's likely they're going to say, see, we got under control with the vaccines, but by the way, there's all these new coronaviruses out there. What we should hear in that is, wow, there's lots of common cold around that's going to cause absolutely no problem. And this has already, in just 5 months, we have more deaths from this series of quote unquote vaccines than the combination of all the vaccines in the last 20 years. More deaths in just a few months than all of the other vaccines put together over the last 20 years. And so we're at over 6,000 deaths now reported, which is considered to be 1% of the actual death toll. So we could be up around, 60,000, or I'm sorry, 600,000 deaths worldwide from the vaccines already. And so
Right.
it's a terrifying reality that we're in, is that we are using a diagnostic tool that should have never been used as a diagnostic tool, i.e. PCR. We're creating a narrative around a failure of relationship to coronaviruses, which has never existed in human history. We've always been in relationship to coronaviruses, and in a balanced fashion. We go through surges of new viral strains that are more like flu, which then go away in 2 years, and then we have a respite for 8 years, and then there will be another flu-like strain, and they'll go back and forth. If we do not start to realize the responsibility of each of us to have a healthy immune system that could be in balance, not just to coronavirus, but to the 10 to the 31 other, 10 to the 31, that's a 1 with 31 zeros after it. There is no name for that number, right? This number is 10 million times more than every star in the entire universe, all right? So billions of stars in every galaxy, billions of galaxies, multiply that all out, all the stars in the universe, now multiply that by 10 million, and you have the number of viruses that are just in the air. And it turns out there's another 10 to the 31 different viruses in the soil. And there's another 10 to the 30 viruses in the ocean water. And so it's like 10 million on 10 million on 10 million times more than our stars in the entire universe are the viruses that we are exposed to. And so when the government comes along and tells you there's one virus out of 10 to the 31 that we have to be concerned about this year, you should be extremely dubious. That's impossible. It's
Mhm.
impossible that suddenly one virus has popped out to give some existential threat, unless it's not actually a virus, but it's chemical warfare. You know, and so as we develop more and more blurring of the lines between the chemistry and genomics of our agriculture system, our food systems, our soil management, and human health, and we're genetic engineering at an insane rate our food right now, and the damage being done to the human genomics through our food, through genetic engineering of the seeds that are producing our food, is giving a terrifying result. We know that the genetic injuries and genetic adaptations that we're making due to eating Roundup resistant genetically engineered seeds, dicamba resistant seeds, 2,4-D resistant seeds, all these chemicals that are literally the cousins of Agent Orange, and dicamba, the cousin of chemical warfare. It's one of the most famous poisons on the planet. We are literally spraying these chemicals now into our food system through genetic engineering of the food seeds. The combination of those, we know that by the third generation of people exposed to these, start to put those genetic modifications into their sperm and ovum. They're called germline mutations, where now we start passing on the genetic modification from the corn and the soybean and everything else that we're consuming. We'll start to integrate that genetic injury, genetic information, genetic disruption into our sperm lines within 3 generations. So by 2050, by 2060, we we start to be unable to back out of this event. We are so screwing up the genomics of our species, more so through our food even than through this vaccine program. We are mucking with the very genetics of our species. Do we have to wait till 2050 to see the results? And the answer is no. We did this with DDT, and the studies with DDT, which was being sprayed in the streets and pools and everything else of suburban homes in the 1950s, it was banned very quickly, finding out that it was a carcinogen and was screwing up, public health. Banned. However, the women who were exposed to that, they actually lived pretty normal lives, the population as a whole, but their children who were born to women who had been exposed to DDT started to have health problems. The next generation, born in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, had even more health complications downstream of that DDT exposure in grandma. The third generation, 3 generations out from DDT exposure, are now starting to adapt those genetic injuries from DDT injury and are starting to integrate that into germline. And now we're in 4th generation and we see germline mutations downstream of DDT exposure.
Mhm.
We already know that from the 1950s, and what's happening in 1996 to 2021 is a terrifying cadre compared to what we did with DDT. So we know we've screwed it up now. The speed at which we now back out of that is going to determine whether we survive as a species or not. We have set in motion our own extinction. We now need to learn Cas9, the innate immune system, what is the endogenous intrinsic relationship to the biome as a whole. If we don't rechannel our billions and billions and billions, it's hard to calculate $4 trillion that we just printed, right? In less than a year, we printed $4 trillion from the Fed out of nothing, and none of that went to figuring out our innate immune system relationship to the virus. That is insanity. How did we think that we were going to somehow genetically engineer the population to be immune to 10 to the 31 viruses? You can't even deliver 10 to the 2. You can't get 100
Mhm.
vaccines into a single person. So what are we thinking when it comes to 10 to the 31? It's impossible. We cannot genetically engineer ourselves into a relationship with nature. What we
Right.
can do is learn how we developed within that nature to be in constant balance with her genetic stream of information delivered by the virome. And so
Mhm.
this is the decision we have as a population of consumers. I don't care if you got vaccinated or not, you need to start to demand a different relationship to nature through our regulatory environments, through our government spending on research and development, through our codependence with the pharmaceutical industry. We need to start to ask the bigger questions of how do we survive the next 100 years? Forget about the next 24 months. How are we going to still be a species in 2030, or 2131, or whatever it ends up being, So
Yeah.
these bigger questions have to be our unified call to action. And we can disagree over vaccines. One thing I do want to point out, I'm sorry to jump around a bit here, but you had such a poignant visual that you said, well, people said there's a fire and the fire truck coming is the vaccine. That's not the biology of the situation at all. This is much more akin to a big fire burning, and you instead decide you're going to start lots of fires around that thing to see if you can get lots more, burn down happening before the big fire hits. There is no water in the fire truck. There's only
Right.
more fire. That's what we're doing, is we are genetically engineering people to make the fire. That's exactly what we're doing. And so there is no water in the fire truck. We need to stop people thinking that. We are fighting fire with fire right now. Is that a
Mhm.
good idea? I would say the biology screams no, but we will find out in the next 24 months with a lot of clarity just what we set in motion here, and we will know what fire on fire looks like.
Right. There's a lot there, and in this conversation, one of the voices that I have in my head is the voice of the skeptic. I listened to the Conspirituality podcast yesterday, where they had a critique of you, among other people, and a conversation that I think you had with I think his name Robert Kennedy Jr. Um, on his show, and we can get to some of the points that they cover in there, but related to this last piece that you just shared, towards the beginning, I find myself, their voice in my head is saying, like, Zach's saying there's all these viruses out there and this is just one virus. Like, so Zach, are you saying that COVID's not a thing and that it's not precipitating all of these deaths in the world, and that it didn't just rip through India, and kill a whole bunch of people, that the hospitals are full? And I don't think you're saying it's not a thing, but I'm curious what your response is to that, like, you know, this thing is having an effect, especially when it has huge breakouts in places. And are you saying that, you know, the reason why this is killing people in large numbers when it really has a giant breakout is because we as a people are, damaging our our bodies and our guts and our whole systems, and the way that our system relates to nature, so much that something like this virus kills a, a decent number of us when it hits a sort of critical mass in the population.
Perfect. I, I've always insisted from the beginning that this is a naturally occurring virus, most likely. There's a small potential that this was, directly a release from a lab. But even if there was a leak from a lab, within minutes of that exposure, it would have had to infect a natural biology, a human, a pig, something. And in that moment, it would have shifted from a genetically engineered, thing in the lab to a naturally occurring virus, because my body is going to adapt my version of that virus. That's how all of these different versions of viruses occurs. Every time it's replicated, there's a change in the sequence. Some of those sequences are not non-functional and they never get replicated. A very small fraction will be functional, and they'll go on to make a new variant that will be able to transfect or move across the populations. So does SARS-CoV-2 exist? Absolutely. We know the genetic sequence. We haven't figured out, some of the new RNA in it is kind of interesting. We don't know what all of it does. And that's why there's been a lot of supposition that this was genetically engineered in the lab, because there's chunks of this that don't look naturally occurring.
Hmm.
But whether that was, a natural rearrangement of, RNA that was coming out of nature, and nature was grabbing stuff out of genetically engineered crops or seeds, or, pulling other forms of, synthetics out, who knows? It doesn't matter to me at source. It's definitely real. My big problem with saying that we have 400,000 deaths in the United States from SARS-CoV-2 is because it's literally scientifically impossible. The deaths that occurred downstream from somebody who was PCR positive for SARS-CoV-2 and presented with a syndrome that we would call COVID-19, that syndrome, COVID-19 is not a virus. COVID-19 is the symptoms that we have come to understand as the pandemic. And so the symptoms around this are, anything from benign as a sore throat to low grade to mid grade fevers to, loss of taste and smell, some neurologic injury there, brain fog, some aches and pains, to all the way to very severe complications that over the 2 weeks, from your first symptoms, turn into this cascading multiple blood clots through all of your organ systems. Your lungs fill with fluid and you die. The difference between the guy saying, well, Zach saying this doesn't exist. Well, no, I've never once said it didn't exist. I've always said it does exist, and this is what's happening. The virus happens in everybody the same way. It comes in through the pulmonary vasculature, and so the vessels within your blood, within your lungs, that are responsible for moving oxygen and carbon dioxide between your lung and the blood. These tiny little pockets of tissue bind to coronavirus, any coronavirus, but SARS-CoV-2 binds to the ACE2 receptor and pulls that genetic information into the bloodstream. And so it's a very nice mechanism of delivery to get the genetic information updated into the human. All right, so the human now uptakes that information. If one person living in the same household, exposed to the same environment, spikes a small fever one night and then is done, has no different symptoms, the other person in the household dies weeks later, it's impossible that the virus is responsible for both, because if the virus had the amount of information in it to kill people, it would have killed both. The person that goes on to die weeks later had no virus in their bloodstream of anything that would be called an infection by the time they presented with symptoms, likely, but definitely not by the time they died.
Right.
Evidence of this was very early on in the New York experience. 5,700 patients admitted to ICUs in New York hospitals were reviewed in the Journal of American Medicine. And in that review, they showed that these 5,700 patients, none of them had a fever, none of them had a white blood cell count suggestive of viral infection, none of them had any signs of changes in their total blood counts that would suggest infection, although almost all of them presented with liver injury, which is their first signs of hypoxia or hypoxic injury that's coming through the gut rather than through the lung. And then and they all had clear chest x-rays. And so there was no signs of pneumonia or other, but they were all hypoxic. So they couldn't transact oxygen in their body. They were absorbing oxygen from breathing, but they couldn't get
Mhm.
the oxygen delivery to work. And they had early signs of
Right.
ischemia or lack of blood flow to the liver. And so that syndrome is called, very well established diagnosis. You can look this up, Google it, histotoxic hypoxia. That is the presentation in 5,700 patients being admitted to this dying of SARS-CoV-2, apparently. Turns out have no signs of infection, no fever, no left shift in the white cells, etc. But they are hypoxic and they're dying of multi-organ hypoxic failure. And 3 days later, 5 days later, their lungs start to fill with fluid because of the number of hypoxic cells within the lungs that start to produce fluid in their injury. In other words, it's the body's response to downstream, toxicity that can be associated with the virus. So how does that work? I covered this very early in the whole pandemic. The virus binds, and this has again been documented in the peer-reviewed literature for decades, is that viruses, especially respiratory viruses like influenza and proven SARS-CoV-2 and MERS and SARS, can bind to the carbon particulate in the atmosphere from air pollution, PM 2.5. And when it
Right.
starts to bind there, you get far too many viruses collecting in one place. And so now your immune system or the blood vessels can get overwhelmed with an enormous amount of genetic information, an overload of genetic input, which could throw you into an imbalance to begin with. But the bigger problem is the virus now delivering PM 2.5 carbon into your bloodstream, because the virus will bind to the ACE2 receptor and as a Trojan horse will carry that toxin in. PM 2.5 carbon is a toxin to vessels, blood vessels, and neurons. But more importantly, cyanide is the most typical chemical from air pollution that binds to PM 2.5.
Mhm.
And so what we did with SARS-CoV-2 going around the world was create the perfect Trojan horse for cyanide poisoning. Just months
Mhm.
before the outbreak, in May of 2019, just a few months before this whole thing started, Earth Justice in the United States started suing US governments or state governments across the country for not telling their population that there had been a sudden explosion in a sudden marked elevation in cyanide in the air pollution of many of the big cities in the country, including New York City, New Orleans, the Four Corners out around Colorado, New Mexico. All of these pockets had documented high cyanide levels. There was Earth Justice lawsuits already in the matrix. And then a SARS-CoV-2 comes along that binds PM2.5 and cyanide and carries it in the bloodstream. Well, if Zach's right about that crazy ass complicated theory, how would that look? It turns out that the most common cause of histotoxic hypoxia in the literature is cyanide poisoning. It presents exactly like the 5,700 patients in New York presented. Now you look at India and you look at northern Italy. What you're looking for when you see high death rates is not a virus. The virus is global. If you go and do PCR literally up on mountains, go PCR the ice form on top of mountains, in the Himalayas, you're going to find coronavirus. It's everywhere now. And so after just a few months, let alone 2 years, that virus has distributed itself through aerosolized particles all over the planet. So it's impossible that we suddenly have a new problem with coronavirus in India. What can happen is a new relationship to the virus that's ever present to toxins in the environment. All we would need to do to go tease this out is show me the PM 2.5 and the cyanide levels in India right before this whole explosion of deaths happened. And I guarantee you, it's towards the end of their winter, right? And so,
Mhm.
towards the end of their winter, they have the highest PM 2.5 levels in any environment that they're going to experience in a year where they hit some very cold temperatures. And India, turns out, heats mostly with kerosene in the homes. They also cook with kerosene in the homes.
Yep.
Kerosene creates a very high PM 2.5 level in those houses. And so your household in India going through the year that they just had, which was they were supposed to go hide away in their houses and not be in public, they just breathed more PM 2.5, more cyanide than they have in any previous flu season slash coronavirus season in history. We set them up for disaster by the interventions we have made, and then you overlay a third world, developing world, cooking heating system around kerosene, and you create this perfect storm. When we're too far into this pandemic for the virus to be responsible for any hotspots globally. And so if we find a hotspot right now, we need to send in toxicology teams, which actually is required by the CDC and the WHO. Anytime there's a suspected outbreak of anything, they don't send the infectious disease team out. They send the infectious disease team and the toxicology team.
Mhm.
They have to do that. It's required because toxic exposure can mimic all of the symptoms of infectious disease. That has not been talked about in the public at all through this whole pandemic. Everybody's trying to hush hush the issue of severe increasing amount of toxicity in the atmosphere from a death of our global soils. It is not an accident that in this last 2 years in India, we see the most intense effort to infiltrate their regulatory environment and their agricultural system with our chemical ag. That you saw this huge protest perhaps on the news that happened over the course of this just a few months back with all these Indian farmers on strike.
Yep.
What they're striking is this pattern of Monsanto and Bayer and all these big chemical companies coming in and trying to sue them into oblivion so that they can move it from peasant farming, which feeds 70% of the planet right now, into this giant chemical ag procedure, which feeds only 30% of the country, the global community. So it's this takeover of chemical industries that then coincides with a quote unquote flare of coronavirus. It can't be. It's the wrong model. There's no biology to back up a new hotspot in India 2 years into a pandemic that they had already gone through two very marginal seasons with. So it's just a frustrating thing where they keep pretending like these correlations are causation.
Mhm.
Sure, there's PCR positive coronavirus in the population, but if you see sudden death tolls rising right now, it's because of something else. It is a Trojan horse or completely unrelated to, but perhaps correlating with the existence of the virus.
Right. Yeah. So you're looking at it, and I know you take a systems approach when you're looking at everything. So you're saying, like, yeah, SARS-CoV-2 is involved in all of these things, but it's also related to what's happening in the environment, right? And when I first heard you, talk about what normal flu season looks like, as the PM 2.5 levels change and as the CO2 levels change in the atmosphere from summer to winter, and if you look at the deaths, especially because it's a better measure of, it's a better statistical measure than, PCR tests, because PCR tests are related to the amount of testing that's happening, how often people are getting tested. If you look at the deaths, especially in an area like Canada, where we have that big swing, where the sun's here and then the sun's pretty far away, right? And you look at the UK, where it's almost on the same level. If you look at the last 2 years, the deaths, they do follow pretty much exactly the normal flu season, right? They go from about December to April,
Yeah.
right? And then there's a sharp drop in May. It happened last year. It happened this year. Yeah, I mean that you definitely woke something up in me when you started describing the larger environmental interactions that are going on that then create these flare ups. And the question I want to ask related to COVID-19 is, you know, we're being quite critical of the vaccine here, and I know that on a macro level, you're like, well, listen, folks, like we need to change the way we take care of our food. We need to take care of our air. We we need to change the way that we relate to the environment. And uh, in the short term, my question is like, what is the alternative to a vaccine, or would you build a vaccine differently? Like, are you advocating that, like, hey, we all need to get SARS-CoV-2 into our bodies somehow, and you know how can I get that virus into my mom and dad who are in their 70s without a vaccine, or you know being a 37-year-old healthy dude, um, I'm not particularly afraid of just getting uh, the virus from the environment, but I do know that if I encounter it in a really high load and I happen to be having a down week, like maybe I smoked some tobacco a few times last week and my immune system's depressed and my lungs are a little hurting, and I get a big dose of a big viral load, you know, maybe I will get slammed. So, can I is there a proposal for receiving some kind of like a tapered dose of this thing? Is there a vaccine that you could envision in your mind that would be uh, a smart way, or a way of vaccinating ourselves without a needle?
Breathing. I would recommend breathing.
Right.
It turns out that breathing is the best way to be exposed to viruses. Your body has developed
Right.
an entire, an extraordinary relationship between the immune system within your lung epithelial cells and deep to that, as well as within the gut epithelial cells and the immune system associated there. That's about 80% of the immune system, if not 90% of the immune system that I just described, lungs and gut. And so I want to be exposed to coronavirus in the healthiest way possible. What does that mean? I want to be in touch with healthy soil, water, and air. And so if you are in a high, pollution, area, you have to come to terms with the fact that you're at risk. So how do you modify those risks if you can't get out of your environment? So you're stuck in New Orleans, you're living in the inner city, you're on welfare, the chance of moving to, rural environment is zero, you're stuck. So now what do we do? Well, now we actually, after dozens of years of looking at pandemics, we have established very clearly what are the other physiologic risk factors for being in a lack of balance with the virus. And it turns out that your number one risk factor, as far as I'm concerned, is vitamin D. Vitamin D has a huge relationship. It modifies over 2,000 different genes in your body, a huge number of which are important to the innate immune system. Cas9 and its whole cascade being a good example of it. And so it turns out that if you have a vitamin D level greater than 50, your chance of getting any viral infection is near zero, and with coronavirus, even more so. Nobody in the world died with a SARS-CoV-2 infection with a vitamin D level greater than 50. 100% success rate at preventing death with vitamin D level greater than 50. Well, where do you get vitamin D from? Ideally, from the sunshine. But if you live in northern latitudes, Canada being a great example, you guys only have a short solar opportunity to get vitamin D activation between about May and September. Anything out of that, you're far enough north that your vitamin D activation at the sun, even at the skin, even when in the sun, is actually quite low. So then you have supplementation as an option. So it only takes about 15 minutes of sunshine on about 15 to 20% of your body surface area to get enough vitamin D to be up in a very good range. Most people don't spend 15 minutes in the sun with 15% of their sun exposed a day. And so we look at supplementation as a backup plan. Supplementation, you're up in kind of 2,000 units for a kiddo, probably up around 5,000 units from an adult. It will determine a little bit, your absorption rate, what your gut health is, a number of different variables. But importantly, you need to get that vitamin D level, up above 50. And so you can get your vitamin D level checked by your primary care doctor anytime. It's covered by insurances largely and all of that. But even if you pay for it out of pocket, it's like, 150 to $200 depending on your laboratory. You'll spend 150 bucks to prevent the whole thing. It costs me 150 bucks every time I have to get PCR to travel so I can get a negative coronavirus test. So I'm spending thousands of dollars a year doing coronavirus testing that does absolutely nothing for my health or preventing the virus. Whereas if I just spent $150 every 6 months to make sure my vitamin D level stays up above 50, we would have had zero deaths from coronavirus related. In fact, we would have radically reduced all viral respiratory deaths with just that single intervention. Then, if you want to add zinc, you have a radical effect. And then, if you want to add lysine, there is no possibility you're going to die from coronavirus. So this is the strategy that I would take is we have to look at this as a relationship, a proactive relationship to the innate immune system if we're going to prevent another pandemic of any virus. If we want this virus to end, we just need a level of 50 in 20% of our population would probably be more than adequate. So who's at highest risk of a low vitamin D level? It's exactly the people that ended up dying from
Right.
SARS-CoV-2. This was the most racial virus in history, right? And so it was low socioeconomic and BIPOC. So anybody with black or otherwise highly pigmented skin is going to be at high risk for death. Well, why is that? It's because the melatonin in the skin, the melanin in the skin that will go on to make the pigment, whether you get a tan or you are born with black skin, the melatonin blocks the absorption of the UV light that's necessary to create the vitamin D from the deep dermis, from the keratinocyte. And so the darker your skin, the less likely it is you can maintain a vitamin D level of 50. And especially in the middle of winter, it's way more likely you're going to have a level less than 15. And if your vitamin D level is less than 15, your chance of death from this virus goes radically up. Are you really dying from the virus? No, you're dying from a lack of immune balance with the toxins that are going to come in with this virus. So the virus brings in toxins, it overwhelms a damaged and deficient immune system due to this chronic vitamin D deficiency by December, January, and February. You're in this, and the darker your skin, the more likely you are to die because your vitamin D level is going to be lower. There's lots of other scary things about that low vitamin D level in regards to toxicity. It turns out that the parathyroid hormone upregulates when you have low vitamin D to start pulling calcium out of your bone because vitamin D is necessary to absorb calcium from your gut. So when calcium deficiency starts to set in due to low vitamin D, PTH goes up. PTH hormone, unfortunately, causes an increase of uptake of aluminum and other heavy metals that are present in air pollution into cells, especially
Right.
into the brain, into the neural system of your nose, into your sensory system of the tongue. So your likelihood of getting neurologic toxicity with that low vitamin D level is going to go up exponentially due to these other kind of hormonal reactions to vitamin D deficiency. Immune deficiency for sure, over response and cascades of inflammation, etc., but also increased uptake of toxins if you have pigmented skin, low vitamin D, and it's a cascade. And so, in this sad way, and because we're not bringing this education to our low socioeconomic inner city environments in the U.S., instead, we're rushing them out for flu vaccines and SARS-CoV-2. We're giving them free bus rides. We're running right now. You can win the lottery,
Right.
$1 million if you get your thing. Like the incentive
Yeah.
programs right now are insane, and they're targeting low socioeconomic people, just like the lottery system always does. And so we are literally giving these artificial economic stimuli of drug response so they will rush out and get a vaccine that's totally untested, knowing that it won't change the number of cases. We're hoping it changes the number of deaths.
Right.
Whereas we could just go and get everybody up to a vitamin D of 50 and be confident that we would reach near 100% efficacy of preventing death. Will there still be coronavirus? Yes. Will there still be people with fever? Yes. But will they get better? Yes. And so that's what we need to do is start to look at these very simple and radically cheap solutions of vitamin D, zinc, lysine. Like, how do we just start changing the food and water system such that we are getting these things out to the population in mass? If this is
Right.
important, why aren't we putting it in food? Why aren't we putting it in, as an easy delivery system in the first couple of weeks of some mention of a new virus in China? We should all run out and buy up our vitamin D.
Yeah, yeah. Like, why isn't it in the drinking water? Like we have all these municipalities in Canada, at least, that they're like, oh, you got to keep everybody's teeth clean. So we're going to put fluoride in the drinking water, even though fluoride in large amounts is really toxic for your system. They tell you not to swallow it when you go to the dentist, but we're going to put it in your water so you're drinking it. And then we tell you to drink lots of water in the day so you can stay healthy. Like it's crazy. Like let's put some vitamin D in the water instead of the fluoride. Um, I love that you're saying this, and you're making it a little bit more clear for me now. One of the questions that I had coming into this call was, yeah, the majority, what I've heard is like 98% of the people who've died from SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 were deficient in vitamin D. And my question that I was going to bring to you about vitamin D was like, well, isn't that reflective of the general population anyways? Like, isn't that just like a weak correlation and not a causative thing, But what I'm hearing you saying here, you're making the case that like, you're not making the case that it's causative, but you're saying like this is a very simple thing that we should be testing and that should have been top of our list because it's so highly correlated that it's crazy that we're not even addressing this.
And you can see this happen socioeconomically. And so, the middle class weekend warrior leaves the city, stops, living life in the cubicle for 2 days a week, and runs out to a national park or to the beach, or because they have the financial capacity to do that.
Right.
For an inner city single mother raising 3 kids, there is no weekend, there is no break, there is no running to the beach, there is no chance for vitamin D recuperation at the end of the week. And so we are going to systematically eliminate our low socioeconomic lifespans and our health through this marginalization of information to this community. It's radically abusive on the public health level, and I believe there is no incentive for the public health groups to change this system. There is no penalty to our public health system if public health gets worse. We have to pay the same taxes whether we have good public health or we don't have public health. We are sending money to the CDC, a non-federal agency. It's a public, or I'm sorry, it's a privately owned company owned by a few families, is the Centers for Disease Control or whatnot. So you have these pseudo governmental agencies taking taxpayer money with absolutely no penalty or expectations of public health. They're there reporting the lack of public health. Well, that's not helpful. That's not a public health program. That's a damage reporting system. We don't need a damage reporting system. We need a healthcare system, and we just don't have that in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you could add to the. I'm thinking about what other populations, and I'm thinking about the incarcerated population in the U.S., which I think is over 1% of the total population of the country. Those guys don't see a lot of sun either, or any vitamins. So you can add them to the mix.
Add nursing homes,
Hmm.
so your nursing home
Right.
population. Add to that the entire population when you say, you know what, you need a social distance. Don't go to work. Stay at home. Homeschool your kids. Put them on Zoom all day. Don't let them go to school where they might actually be outside for a few minutes. Keep them at home. Keep them on Zoom all day, and help them with their homework late into the night. And then, if you're in India, homeschool and heat your house with kerosene. It's like we're doing exactly the opposite interventions if we really believed in human health.
Amazing. Zach, we're at an hour and 10, and I want to be conscious of time. So I think maybe we have time for one more question. Um, when I listened to the Conspirituality podcast yesterday, and I was listening to these guys, um, with a certain attitude of arrogance, going after your way of seeing things and criticizing some of the things that you said. Um, the the biggest one that hit me was they look at the way that you talk about homeostasis in in nature as this kind of like naive romanticism. They call it romanticism. You're romanticizing nature. And that they played a clip and they were laughing about it while it was playing. And I thought to myself, like, this is really interesting. The way that Zach is talking is in many ways how I've heard uh, First Nations elders talk about nature and how we need to be in homeostasis with nature, how we need to listen to Mother Nature, listen to Mother Nature. And when you say Mother Nature, these guys are laughing. Like he's talking about Mother Nature, like it's a spirit or something, right? And I'm thinking like, how this is very interesting, because if Zach was First Nations, I don't think they would be laughing right now because that would be very inappropriate. But because he's a white guy, he should be a scientist. He should be, you know, um, and like I don't think they'd be laughing about the medicine wheel on their show. But to quote them, here's a piece from their show. In 1900, 30% of deaths were children under 5. 1 century later, it was 1.4% of all deaths. Thank you, vaccines and antibiotics and hygiene practices. If we were in a state where 30% of deaths were children, I think we wouldn't have such grandiose beliefs that we now have. We have this science and these advances. We're now we're now turning our back on them because there's problems with our systems. But the overall science and medicine is sound. This over romanticization of who we are is going to be part of our downfall.
Yeah,
How do you
perfect.
respond to that?
Uh, First of all, they're right that the mortality went down in children under 5 between those dates that they gave. But what they didn't
Mhm.
tell you is that the vast majority of that improvement happened by 1940. The first vaccines come out in the 1950s, and so long before the first vaccine, we saw radical improvements in children's survival and life sequences thereafter. And so there is no question public health improved in that first half of the century. What happened between 1960 and 2000 is we declined public health radically. So by the 1960s, we had 1.2 to 2.5% of children with chronic disease. That's awesome. That was a great improvement from where we were in 1900. But unfortunately, between 1960 and 2000, we went to 40% of children with a chronic disorder or disease. And now in 2020, we're now over 50% of children in the United States and Germany and other Western countries with a chronic disorder or disease. We went backwards.
Right,
So for all of the
right,
gains we made through improving water, and that's really the 99% of the reduction in mortality in children, is you stop them drinking water that's contaminated with poop. That's it.
right,
That's why we improved we gave them wells, or we gave them municipal water systems that weren't drinking cholera.
right,
And so that's why the mortality rate went down, is we cleaned up their water system. We also improved our food nutrition delivery in those first 50 years. And we went through pockets of really bad systems. We had the Dust Bowl, we had collapse of the agricultural system, we had widespread starvation in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. So it wasn't like a linear improvement. We went through big, mistakes that we made in soil management, food production, went back into starvation, huge child mortality, all of that. So it wasn't like we suddenly like figured out, cracked the code, but we were systematically starting to improve soil, water, and air systems. You have to remember how toxic the air was in the late 1800s in cities. It was all wood burning stoves and coal that was
right,
burning in people's basements. The amount of coal particulate in New York City in the 1880s was horrific. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't see. If you
right,
see pictures in wintertime in New York or LA or whatever, in those kinds of ancients, it was black air. We improved when we stopped burning coal in households. We went to oil and natural gas over that first 50 years. We started using different forms of energy instead of burning coal in the household. So we saw improvement in health. But none of that had to do with a vaccine or some new pharmaceutical breakthrough. None of it. In fact, as the pharmaceutical industry really got its foothold in the 1950s and 60s, which is the right timeline, we started to really see the collapse of human health in those following decades. Then you see the agricultural system by the 1970s being taken over by the same industries, the chemical industries. And so then by the 1996, you have both big ag and big health being owned by the same pharmaceutical industries. And that's when we saw the complete collapse, not just of human health, but of human productivity. Sperm counts through all
right,
Western countries diving, all of this. So I laugh so much that they loved to toot their own horn by these 100-year intervals without thinking about what the trajectory was. Yeah, we were on a great course, and now we're on a crashing course, and you're going to ignore the fact that we are on this radical downward delivery.
Right.
But something much deeper is there for you, and you hit on it so beautifully, is they are spot on. I am freaking romantic about nature. I think it's the most romantic story I've ever heard, that a planet in some far-flung suburb of a small galaxy that we call the Milky Way has billions of stars, billions of suns. We're a tiny little sun. We're a small sun. We're a pathetically small sun. We have a small sun with a small solar system in a relatively moderate sized galaxy in the face of a billion other galaxies. And yet, the dance of nature decided to allow for single celled organisms to emerge within the water systems of this planet 4 billion years ago. And that dance started to learn how to transfer genetic information in the form of viruses 3.5 billion years ago. And through this genetic engineering of the planet through Mother Nature, we see something amazing occur, is that with every single event on Earth, cataclysmic extinction events to times of abundant flourishing of life, at every single step, she did two things. She improved adaptation and she maximized biodiversity. At no point did she try to micromanage life on Earth. She created mechanisms of biology that would allow for adaptation and biodiversification at every single event. And that's beautiful. And what emerged was spectacular. I, I've often wondered what it would have been like to be in Canada 60 million years ago. When I go to British Columbia and outside of Calgary there, for example, um, you can go and see the incredible dinosaur museums there.
Drumheller.
Drumheller. Go to Drumheller and imagine what it would have been like to walk around the plains of Canada 60 million years ago to witness those animals in their native life. Just spectacular creatures. And then an asteroid hit, wipes out life on Earth, poisons the oceans by choking out the topsoil. Same thing we're doing today. Nonetheless, nature never tried to struggle back to recreate the dinosaurs. And so in this story of yours, which is the evolving man, isn't it fascinating that nature decided to, instead of go try to recreate some damaged ecosystem, it created new ecosystems. It evolved into flowering plants. Before that, it's mostly ferns and plants that didn't have seed systems and all that. Afterwards, we get flowers and we get pollination and we get flowering trees and we get deciduous trees and we end up moving into this extraordinary explosion of animal life. We get mammals, tens of millions of years later. And then from the mammals, we get the emergence of mankind. That's a freaking romantic story. And if you look at the biology of the planet, is that we, go beyond the biology actually, go to the biophysics. If you look at the smallest thing ever discovered in science, it is Planck's constant. It is the diameter of the vibration of the electromagnetic field in a vacuum. Planck's constant is the smallest thing we've ever measured and recorded its density, its properties, and all of that. So you have Planck's constant, the vibration of the electromagnetic field in a vacuum. The largest thing we've ever wrapped our head around is the universe in its diameter, in its vibration. And if you plot those two things out, you end up with the highest vibration, tiniest thing, and the lowest vibration, biggest thing, and you get a straight line between those. You can then plot out every other physical structure known to mankind, quasars, stars, planets, all the way down to single atoms, cells, and you plot that along this line, and they all line up. And dead center between Planck's constant and the universe is human biology.
Hmm.
That's pretty freaking romantic. We
Yes, very cool.
are the epicenter of all things ever measured. We are the epicenter of all things ever measured in the universe. I don't even know what that means, but I know it's beautiful, it's eloquent, and we have high purpose. And so while these guys can laugh at me all day long, I am so excited about what I don't know. I'm so excited about this mystery of life that it would allow us to emerge in the first place. We've only been here for 200,000 years and we walk around pounding our chests like we figured out how to prevent childhood disease. Well, nature figured out how to make life. You know, what are you what is your argument, like what is your stance on the hubris of mankind and our great accomplishments? Like we are pathetic, we are the most destructive, extractive species that's ever been on this planet. We are the first species to coordinate the literal extinction of the planet. We are
Mhm.
doing this. And so I welcome the attention to the question, because I think there's an opportunity here for people to ask the same thing you did. Is like, wait, this sounds. I kind of want a romantic story. I don't want to be in conflict. I don't want a war story between nature and mankind. That warlike mentality is going to kill us. If we continue to fight fire with fire, we will burn, and we are burning.
So well said. I share much of that sentiment. And, I feel like if I was in a room with those guys responding to them without you present, my response would be like, and correct any piece of this that's inaccurate is Zach's not anti-science, anti-sanitation, anti-medical establishment. He beyond that, he's focused on something that's like bigger and more overarching and more like, holistic, which is clean air, clean water, and clean soil, which means clean food. And those three things are paramount to human life. And that when those things are messed up, we can't engineer our way out of the problem. We can't invent some new technology to just fix the thing when the foundation pieces are crumbling. We're like literally dissolving our foundation with acid currently and like trying to like build a new thing, a new foundation on the top somehow, like uh, you're trying to address the foundation of things. And I think sometimes when you talk and you share the way that you share, people just project like, oh, this guy's a conspiracy theorist, or he's like way out there. But the more I listen to you and try to really understand your mind, is like, no, this guy's like a really big thinker. He's a trained doctor. He knows how the medical establishment works. He knows how biology works, and he actually thinks bigger than that establishment. And his view is like, oh, like look at everything else that's interconnected in the system that is not, it's not in homeostasis. It's toxic. It's broken. It's, we're messing it up. Yeah, we're burning it. And that needs to be addressed because we're taking a very narrow view at this problem, and we need to take a wider view.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish you would just write a book called Zach Bush's Brain. That way I could stop talking. You synopsized, 8 years of my life so much better than I can. So spot on. So Zach Bush's Brain in a nutshell. Just re-listen to that last 2 minutes, and you don't have to listen to any podcast I've ever done.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, I appreciate that. And actually, this was really good for me. This podcast was really good for me to like just talk this stuff out with you and just look at some of like, what are the criticisms of this guy's position, and like where are the holes, and like I could ask you lots of other little questions about the stuff that you've covered here. And by the way, I'll try to get as many resources from you in terms of studies that you've shared, so that we can list them in the show notes so that people can actually go and do their own research. But I feel like at the end here, I really have come to a better understanding of who you are and how your mind works. And, um, coming into this show, I was asking myself, like, why do I trust this guy versus, the criticisms that I was hearing about him yesterday? Like, why does my heart always come back to like, no, I trust this man's mission, even though sometimes he goes on a rant where it's 15 minutes long and I'm sort of tracking him, but he's like taking me somewhere, and it's almost like like, take me for a ride, Zach. And the guys who are criticizing are like, listen, he's manipulating you, he's like taking you on a journey. But uh, I'm like, why do I trust him? Why do I trust that he's that his intentions are good here? And uh, you know I just trust that your heart is in the right place, and that you have a wealth of experience in your life that really balances out your take on things, and you have a lot of wisdom that you're bringing to people, and that became more clear through this episode. So I thank you again for taking the time with me.
I appreciate it. And, I think we can go back to where we began, which is there's a paradox, and these guys are telling a very clear cut, as is the, multi-billion, multi-trillion dollar media of the planet right now is telling a very coherent narrative. They want us to believe a very simple story, is that in December of 2019, a new virus came up and is killing humanity. And if we don't figure out some new technology, this will kill us. That's a very cohesive narrative. It's very simple. My narrative is also simple. We are in an extinction event. We seem to have engineered it. This pandemic seems to be symptomatic of a collapse of human health. What are the underpinnings of the collapse? Soil, water, and air systems. And so, as you have so well said, we have this exciting paradigm where we are going to continue to understand ourselves separate from nature, or we're going to start to, perhaps for the first time since Western civilization, start to imagine ourselves back into nature. And this is the First Nations message. This is all Indigenous people saying, what's modern society doing? And I'm about to take this extraordinary trip into the Amazon and spend time with these indigenous wisdoms that have been speaking of this era. This 20-year period has been prophesied for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, by many indigenous peoples all over the planet. Within me is indigenous blood. Within you is indigenous blood. We all were indigenous somewhere. It was Western civilization that decided to pull us out of that intelligence. We all got the indigenous blood and the mindset and the wisdom engineered out of us by believing science, by believing the narrative of industry and the narrative of technology. And we swapped out our intuitive knowingness of how the universe worked for new scientific rigor that would then break that whole system apart and lose the forest for the trees. And so that's the frightening thing that I see happening now is we have so failed in our own trust of ourselves. I hope nobody ever listens to a podcast that I've done anywhere for the last 8 years and believes me. Instead, I ask everybody to listen between my words to yourself. What are you resonating? Because in the end, my words are only half right. Like the science is so incomplete. Everything I can talk for 3 hours and I've scratched the surface of the real science around viruses and your Cas9 enzymes. So there is no depth that I can compute to you in verbal capacity. But what I can do is pluck a string. I can hit a chord that makes you vibrate. And this, Ben, is why you trust me, is because you're not trusting me. You're trusting your own reaction to the harmonic. You know that you're harmonizing with something within me. And you don't know if it's the last 15-minute monologue that you didn't even understand or anything else. I know that people are trusting the hope of nature through my words because of the information they're getting between the words. And so I'm totally fine with people picking apart my words because the more they do that, they're going to spend more and more time between the words. And they're going to find out that they trust themselves on their own path back into nature. And they might do that in the extinction event. And that's okay. If we die together, I will celebrate that if we do it awake and we realize our mistakes and we realize, wow, what hubris we had that we thought we were somehow separate from this nature and we needed to pound it back through chemical breakthroughs in the pharmaceutical industry and genetic engineering, and we had to somehow genetically engineer our survival instead of just embracing the fact that we have been provided for by a nature that's far more intelligent to us because of its 4 billion run on the problem, 4 billion year run on the problem.
Yeah.
It's been figuring out life for 4 billion years on the planet. 4 billion is a very large number. Billions, 1,000 million. 4,000 million years. Like, wrap your head around that for a second and wonder if the last 4 months of pharmaceutical sprint to create this fire truck of a vaccine is something to be trusted in the face of 4 billion years of the march of life. So it's an exciting time, and I hope that we have plucked something within each of you who are listening to know that you are evolving, that you are shifting right now, whether you maybe most potently if you think I'm completely full of BS and you're on a new journey and you're going to go dissect this information for your own journey and you're going to find the truths within you, which may very much embrace this vaccine. You say, I know what this vaccine is going to do for me. I'm going to get antibodies and that's important to me. All right, well, go get the vaccine and make that important to you and then walk the journey. I'll be your control group and we'll find out in 2 years through good science what happens to me and what happens to you. And that'll be exciting. Meanwhile, over those 2 years, the world is going to try to take away all my civil liberties for not being vaccinated, which is very
Right.
interesting because that gives us a socio-political experiment. What happens when you take away people's civil liberties over the argument of health? And what happens if they turn out to be healthier? What have you done to the socioeconomics and how have you justified your political moves at the end of those 2 years? Is there other things that are at play than a health argument or an argument about viruses that is moving to take away civil liberties than this pandemic? Did this pandemic happen at a time in history when we actually had great vulnerability to the powers that be, to the socioeconomic structures that are just on the brink of collapse. Did we need something to justify $4 trillion of quantitative easing and printing of dollars out of the Fed? We probably did. And so these are the bigger
Mhm.
stories that will evolve. Yes, we'll figure out the virus, but I hope we figure out civilization, because we have an uncivil civilization. And it's to the civility that I hope for. And I hope that there's a future where whatever dudes, I can't even remember the conspiracy thing you were just talking about, but I hope they invite me on their show instead of just throwing darts.
Right.
Let's have a dialogue. That would be humane. That would be actually something in the pursuit of knowledge. But throwing mud pies at each other does nothing for human consciousness or knowledge or anything else. Refine my knowledge. If you have science that I haven't considered, please bring it to my attention and let's test it. Let's figure it out.
Yeah, I really hear that, Zach. This this thing has created this last year and a half has created an upheaval on a world scale, but it's also created upheaval, even just in on the micro scale. I think for each person that's involved, each person on the planet, even just in my own life, the conflict that I had with my parents about my choice to, I haven't been vaccinated yet, and I very well may not get vaccinated. That me revealing that to my parents, and my dad's a retired doctor, and uh, it created the biggest uproar that has happened between me and them in my adult life, and it created a really big shakeup between me and them, and my wife was involved as well, and just the relationship was really strained, right? And it was like, well, what's your problem with us doing what we want to do? And because we have the tools to navigate our relationship, I've had some really good clearing conversations, and I feel like what's going to come of this is a better relationship between myself and them, and my wife and my parents. And so, like, I really feel like on that micro scale, like what you're talking about, this your civil liberties being taken away because of because of all of this. It's like, I feel like in a way we needed a struggle. We haven't had a really big struggle like this in a long time. And my micro struggle in my family, because we have the right tools, we're actually going to be healthier on the other side of that. And that's my hope for this whole situation as well. That, I don't think it's over, but like this struggle, you know, evolution, it does well in a struggle. What comes out the other side is something better. So I hope that that's the case for us, for humanity. And in my world, you're a big part of that.
Wow.
So thanks, Zach.
I appreciate that. Glad to be part of your world. I'm honored to be part of yours, Ben, and so glad you and your wife are well and thriving up there in Canada and enjoying the best part of the year in Vancouver right now. I love spring there, so enjoy the weather there, enjoy the sunshine, get your vitamin D. You'll need it come the winter, and we'll
Yeah,
enjoy the next season. Take care.
thanks, Zach. All the best to you.